Okay, so I've met some of you before, but for those I haven't, my name is Alan Easley, and I was elected the treasurer of the Synod 2 years ago. So I've been doing this for 2 years now, and I'm still learning as I go. Um, but I want to thank, in particular, Terry Robertson for her help to keep me on the straight and narrow path when I occasionally am threatening to walk off in the wrong direction. Um, and Terry asked me to remind all of you that if you intend to also participate in the hearing on resolutions, which is at 12:15 p.m. Pacific time, that's a different link from the one you're on right now. So you have to sign off of this meeting when we're done. And then Terry, if you had registered for the hearing on resolutions, would have sent you another email with a different link for that. We're going to go through the part of the assembly notebook that has all the financial reports and financial information. We're going to go through it pretty quickly, so that hopefully there's time for questions. If you do have questions in the middle, don't feel that you have to wait for the end. You can use the raised hand function, which I think is an item on the sort of bottom menu of the Zoom screen, or you can type your questions in the chat, and Terry will be paying attention to both the raised hand function and the chat, so that if something comes up in the middle of the meeting, we can address it then. That's usually easier than trying to wait till the end. And the other thing I would note at the outset is that the Assembly will be voting on the proposed 26-27 budget next Saturday, a week from today. And should you want to propose amendments to that budget proposal, they have to be submitted by Friday, the 16th at 3:30 p.m. And I'll share a little bit more information about how to do that shortly. But Terry's going to share the portion of the assembly notebook that contains all the financial stuff. So we'll just go through it page by page, starting with page 3-1. So can everybody see that? So this is a chart that we produce every year, a graph that shows historical trends in financial giving for the Synod over the past 7 years. So this is from 2018-19 to 2024-25. And the total giving each year is the blue line up towards the top of the chart. And the red one is mission support. That's the tithes that individual congregations make to the Synod. And then green is designated gifts, also from congregations mostly, but designated for specific purposes. So it's not just mission support, but it may be other worthy ALCA causes or Synod causes. And then purple pulls out specifically, that's the one way down at the bottom, designated gifts from congregations to ELCA World Hunger, because we also always have a steady amount of money coming in for that. Mission support is the largest item. It represents nearly half of the Synod's budget, as we'll see shortly. And I always think it's important to call out the mission support, because I think this is a measure of the strengths or the struggles of our congregations within the Synod. You can see, if you look at that red line, that there are occasional small upticks, but that the trend over the last 7 years is mostly downward. And the last year, 20, that's on this chart, um, which was 24-25, we had a total of mission support for the year of 1.172 million. Was there did I see a question from?
Yeah, Pastor Darren asks, this compares 2025 year to date, a half a year to the previous full years. No, these are all full years.
Now I
Right.
understand. It's the
Okay.
fiscal year from February
Yeah.
to January.
Yeah.
Got it.
Yeah,
Thank you.
exactly. Yeah, that's a good question, though. One thing that I want to note on this graph, because it sort of stands out, is that both the blue line and the green line have a significant uptick, not in 24-25, but in the year before that, 23-24. And that on the green line, which is the giving by congregations for designated causes, the reason for that uptick was the substantial amount of support that came in from congregations for the Hawaii wildfire victims. And that we're still getting money actually now for that a little bit, but most of it came in 23-24. So it's not that there was a huge drop off in 24-25. It's just that we had 1 year of exceptional giving and then sort of a reversion to the mean. So typically over time, our designated gifts from congregations has ranged between 350,000 and 400,000. And it was just a lot more than that for that 1 year. The next slide. This is a pie chart that contains essentially the same information on financial gifts to the Synod that you saw in the previous slide, but with one addition. And here we're just looking at 1 year instead of a 7-year period. So in blue, you can see the mission support from our congregations, the 1.172 million, which represented in that year roughly 40% of our revenue. And then designated gifts from our congregations broken out into 4 categories. Designated gifts to the ELCA ministries in orange, Hawaii Wildfire Relief purple, Pacifica Ministries green, and other designated ministries red, totaling for 24-25, $355,000. And the other income included in the pie chart, but not on the previous slide, is non-congregational income, which is on the left side of this pie chart, sort of the reddish brown color. This portion of Synod income fluctuates quite a bit from year to year. In the prior year, 23-24, it was $562,000. This past year, 24-25, it was $1.434 million. And it included this past year over $1 million in funds received from the proceeds of one closed congregation, as well as support that we get every year from the ELCA for our director for evangelical mission position that we share with the ELCA, and then the allocation of resources held by the Synod to help fund Synod activities. Next one. This pie chart looks at our actual expenditures in 24-25. So the darker blue is the mission support that we send to the ELCA, and the green is grants to institutions and agencies. And they're both shown in this pie chart as percentages of total expenditures for the year. But it's important to understand that the dark blue and the green, the 51%, and the 8.2% is of the money that came in from mission support from congregations. So of the $1.172 million that came in last year in mission support from congregations, 51% of that is dedicated to ELCA mission support. That's the dark blue, and 8.2% of the 1.172 million is awarded to a list of institutions and agencies that the Synod has been supporting for some time now. And last year that amounted to $98,000, again, the green. And those grant beneficiaries that we're talking about that get portions of the 8.2% of mission support include Agape San Diego, the San Diego State University Campus Ministry, Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary, Lutheran Planned Giving Partnerships, Lutheran Social Services, Lutheran Retreats, Camps and Conferences, Cal Lutheran, and a couple of other agencies and entities. And while some of these grants are quite small, several are significant in size, including one for just over $25,000 and one for over $42,000. But I think it's important to note that these two pieces of the expense pie represent nearly 60% of the mission support that the Synod receives each year from congregations. So we dedicate 51% of mission support to the ELCA and 8.2% to these grants. So you add those together, and that means that close to 60% of the mission support we get from congregations we're passing on to other entities. The light blue slice on the left, which represents 52% of expenses for the year, is Synod administration, the expenses necessary to sustain Synod operations. Of the total of 1.164 million, roughly 80% of that is compensation and benefits to staff. The rest includes other administrative costs, including insurance, equipment leases, contract and professional services, utilities, and other things like that. And then we have the very small purple slice at the bottom, which is the support we have in the budget for Synod ministries, an amount that, as we'll talk about a little bit later, we've been trying to grow slowly from where it has been to something a little bit more substantial.
Alan, we have a question in the chat about the first slide. Susie wants to know, back on the first slide, the numbers from last fiscal year look like they're quite a bit lower than the norm before the uptick in donations for the fire victims in Hawaii. Is there any reason for that? So
I think actually from 2018-19 until the uptick is just the norm. That's been it's been pretty steady between 350,000 and 400,000 in congregational designated giving. And then we just had one year that, because of the horrific wildfires in Hawaii, everything jumped up a lot. And then it came back down to to a more normal level.
Something to keep in mind, the designated funds, designated giving, 100% of that goes right back out. So it's kind of like pass-through giving. If somebody in your congregation gives towards World Hunger, you're going to send it off to World Hunger. So,
Right,
and so this designated giving, 100% of that money that we receive that's designated for something or somewhere else goes to that purpose. It's not retained by the synod at all. And sometimes congregations have different views on that. Sometimes congregations like to send all of their giving through the synod, meaning their mission support plus their designated gifts. And sometimes congregations send, let's say they've collected for disaster relief, rather than sending it through the synod, which delays it a bit to getting to the disaster organizations, they'll send it directly. So it's really some of this, besides the Hawaii wildfire, can be congregations either maybe still giving the same amount of designated giving, but maybe sending it directly. Or it could be
right.
congregations with less ability to send designated gifts to support stuff outside of that.
Right. And it's important to note that that green line really is money that's just passed through. It comes to us from the congregations, and then it goes out to the organizations that they designated the money for. So it doesn't really impact our bottom line budget. It's just passed through. And Terry, you're right that not all the money that congregations give to other organizations comes through the synod. So the amount we're looking at here is just the amount that the congregations have chosen to pass on to other organizations through us. Okay, I think we're up to slide 3-4. So this slide shows our financial position at the end of 24-25. It's sometimes referred to as a balance sheet. And what it shows is that we have assets of $15.9 million, which has grown over time. It's taken a while to accumulate all those assets. And then there are offsetting liabilities and equities. So we have on this chart, we have 11.44 million in financial assets that are invested in various vehicles, which we'll talk about shortly. We have 2.34 million in fixed assets related primarily to the Center for Learning in Santa Ana. And then on the liability side, both the designated funds of 8.95 million and our temporarily restricted funds of 2.11 million are reserves that are set aside for future use. And then we also have some permanently restricted funds from donors. So we end up, the balance in this balance sheet is the 2.27 million in unencumbered equity. Next slide. So this slide addresses how we're investing the 11.44 million in financial assets that we hold. And this is kind of small, an eye chart, a little hard to read, but we have several MIF term investments that are grouped together in the top half of the page with maturity dates in 2025, 2026, and 2027. And these are buckets of funds that we know that we will need to access down the road, but we don't necessarily need them right away. And the maturity dates of these term investments are intentionally spread out so that we can gain access to these funds over time as we need them. This is part of a concerted effort that started before I became treasurer to figure out a way to not have significant amounts of money that we don't need right away just sitting in our checking account. So by passing the funds through these term investments, we're able to make the funds work for us until we reach the point where we need them. You might also notice, if you can see it, that there is another MIF term investment, 6 years in length, that actually matured in January. So right now it has a zero balance. But before January, it had a balance of 1.8 million. And these are funds that actually belong to Agape San Diego, the campus ministry at San Diego State. And they came from the closure of congregation in San Diego. But we've been holding those funds for Agape for those 6 years. The term investment matured, the funds were withdrawn, and they're now in Agape San Diego's hands, and they are planning to use this money to help fund a new building that will function as meeting space and student housing for the campus ministry. So you might see at some point in time in the future, when we look back at things historically, that we had $1.8 million that disappeared. And that would not surprise me if that raised questions in some people's minds about, okay, what happened there? Well, what happened is we were holding the money for Agape, and then we handed it over to them. So nothing unusual. We have several endowment funds managed by the ELCA, including the Matthew 25 and Warner Trust funds. And we have several Thrivent funds with varying dollar amounts and varying investment objectives, from conservative to aggressive. And we have a long-term investment in the Nuveen Aggressive Fund, which is an actively managed fund that's now holding $3.6 million. Roughly 80% of that is in equities. And it frankly has dramatically fluctuated in the last quarter of 2024 and the early months of 2025. But it earned 11% in 2024 over the course of the full year. And in years before that, it's done even better. So our idea there was that this is money we don't need for a while, and we want to invest it aggressively to try and maximize our return on investment. And our finance committee meets at least every 2 months and actively reviews our investments to try to maximize the funds available for our various ministries while minimizing risk. Okay, so now, Terry, if you could skip ahead to 3.7, that one, and then we'll go back to 3.6. When we're talking about the budget, it's important to keep in mind a couple of things as we look at the timing of how we approve budgets and what the assembly will be asked to approve next week. The Synod's fiscal year, and we kind of alluded to this a few minutes ago, the fiscal year runs from February of one year to January of the next year. So when we see 24-25, we're talking about the budget year that ends in January 25. The budget that the assembly will be asked to approve is one that runs from February of 26 to January of 27. But if you think about how this works in terms of the timing of when the budget year starts and ends and when we approve budgets, we are already partway through the 25-26 budget year. That started in February and we're in May now. So it's too late now to set and approve the 25-26 budget because we're a good chunk of the way into that budget already. But the 26-27 budget year doesn't actually start for another 8 months, and it's going to extend through a period that ends 20 months from now. So at last year's assembly, the assembly voting members were asked to approve the 25-26 budget that was being recommended by the Synod Council based on the information that was available at the time. But of course, when the budget year starts 8 months later, it's not that surprising that sometimes assumptions and needs change over the course of that time. So at this point in time, if you look at the columns in this part of the chart, and this continues through also 3-7 through 3-14. What we have before us in columns of numbers moving from the left to right is in the left-hand column of numbers, we have the 23-24 audited actuals. Then right next to that, we have the 24-25 audited actuals, so 2 years of historical data. Then the 25-26 budget that the Assembly approved last June. And then what we call the spend plan for 25-26. And this generally follows fairly closely the approved budget, but recognizing that this budget that we approved last year was approved 8 months before the start of the budget year, and that assumptions and circumstances change. The spend plan approved by the Synod Council last March essentially tweaks the budget that the Assembly approved based on what we now know. And so we refer to it as a spend plan for how we're going to live out that 25-26 budget this year. And then finally, in the right-hand column, the blue column, we have the budget that we'll be asking the Assembly to approve for 26-27. So last year we had the Assembly approve the 25-26 budget, and then we adjusted it slightly through the Synod Council as we got closer to the start of the fiscal year and got into the early months of the fiscal year to reflect more closely the reality of the assumptions we're facing. And then we're going to do the same thing next year. So if we go back to slide 3-6 now, this slide summarizes some of the basic assumptions that drive the spend plan for 25-26 and the budget proposal for 26-27. And for starters, our spend plan and budgets are largely driven by the mission support we receive from our congregations, because as I said before, that represents nearly 50% of the income that supports the budget. And so because the mission support that we actually received in 24-25 ended up being somewhat lower than what we anticipated in the budget, we adjusted the assumptions about mission support in the 25-26 spend plan downward to more closely match the actuals for the immediately prior year. And then for 26-27, in the budget we're presenting to the Assembly to vote on, we assumed that mission support would stay flat. And then we have assumptions related to anticipated non-congregational income, money we expect to receive from the ELCA to support the shared director for evangelical mission, and money we anticipate drawing from designated funds to support synodical operations. And then on the expense side, we of course have the 51% of mission support that we pass on to the ELCA and the 8.2% of mission support that we distribute to the list of institutions and agencies that are in the budget. And then we have increases to salary and benefits of 3.2% in 25-26 in the spend plan and 2% in 26-27. And the 2% number is really just a placeholder because 26-27 is still quite a ways off. And so we don't want to get locked in with any exactitude to what we think will be the increase in salary and benefits in 26, 27, because we'll have more information as we get closer to that date that might cause us to adjust all of that. And then back to slide 3.7 again. So this slide summarizes all of the budget information that's presented in greater detail, in line by line detail on pages 8 through 13. But this kind of collapses all the categories and puts it in summary format in one page. So on the income side, we have mission support staying flat. We have restricted designated contributions that fluctuate a little bit from year to year, but they're generally in the $400,000 range. And as we noted a little bit ago, this doesn't really impact our budget because these funds are pass-through funds that go from our congregation to the synod and then to the designated recipients designated by the donors. And then we have non-congregation income that fluctuates a lot more because it's largely dependent on whether we have closed congregations with the proceeds generated by the closing coming to the synod. And while some of those funds are used to support the day-to-day work of the synod, what we call synodical administration, a significant amount of these funds are not fed into the budget, but are designated to support growth in existing or new ministries within the synod. And we'll talk about that a little bit more towards the end. On the expense side, the benevolence expenses are very much driven by the mission support and designated contributions from congregations. Synod office expenses include everything related to the operations of the synod, including compensation benefits for staff and all the other operational expenses listed. The growth in comp and benefits is partly due to cost of living increases, but some of it is due to staffing adjustments made when we realized that we needed to add staff to meet important objectives of the synod, including candidacy coordination, anti-racism, Latin ministry, and communications. And then we have important work being done by various ministry teams, and we're trying as best we can to support those activities. So total expenses under the spend plan for 25-26 will be about 2.27 million. And for the budget to be presented to the Assembly for approval for 26-27, it'll be about 2.29 million. And if we go to the next slide, we're not going to spend a lot of time on the details, but I do want to talk a little bit about this first slide. First, under non-congregation income, which I don't know if you can see this, but under non-congregation income, the fifth line down, we have something labeled designated fund support income. These are funds that have been designated to support synodical administration, to support the costs of operating the synod. And there used to be several lines in the budget that fed into this, but we kind of consolidated it all into one line. So when a congregation closes, funds generated by the closing are often left to the synod for various purposes. And a significant portion of the funds, as I mentioned, goes to mission funds to support the growth of existing or new ministries. But there is a portion of these funds that has been designated for synodical administration to support the important operations of the synod. And this budget line represents our current estimate of how much of those funds we will need to balance the budget for 26-27. as well as to balance the spend plan for 25-26. And if it turns out we need less, then we won't need, this line will shrink and we won't need to use as much of those designated funds. And if it turns out that the budget requires that we add more to that line in order to balance the budget, then we have the resources to do that as well. And then on the bottom of page 8, and then continuing on to page 9, under programs, grants, and partnerships, we have a list of the institutions and agencies that are beneficiaries of the 8.2% of undesignated mission support received from congregations that the Synod passes on to these agencies. So the total mission support grants line, which is about a third of the way down on page 9, is calculated each year as 8.2% of the total mission support received that year. So just as mission support fluctuates from year to year, so does the 8.2% for these grants. And most of these individual grants are also themselves based on a percentage of the total. So they fluctuate as well. So the total benevolence expenses number at the middle of page 9 for the 26-27 budget at 1.049 million represents 46% of budgeted Synod expenses for the year. Now on pages 3.9 and 3.10, we go into a lot of line-by-line detail about comp and benefits and continuing ed, professional expenses, travel. I won't spend any time there unless there are questions, nor will I really talk about slides 3.10 and 3.11, which detail line-by-line other operational expenses. I want to skip down to slide 3.12. 3.12 has a heading for synodical leadership, events, education, and ministry teams. And if you look more closely at these lines, you can see some of the details of what's included here, included training grants, support for ministry teams. You can also see, over the past several years, the efforts by the Synod to grow some of these support mechanisms, to grow the budget for anti-racism, accessibility, tapestry, Amparo, immigration and border work. And I think it's worthy of note that if you look at the total expenses in this section of the budget, shown on page 3.12, it's grown from $20,292 in 23-24 to $36,750 in 26-27. That's still not where we want it to be, but that is over a 3-year period an 81% increase in the support for these different leadership and education ministry teams. So this is the budget, the blue column again, that will be voted on next week. And as I mentioned earlier, any motions to amend the proposed 26-27 budget have to be submitted by Friday, May 16th at 3:30 p.m. And at the very bottom of this page, I think it's this, oh no, yeah, this one. There is a link, right, in that small print at the bottom there's a link to an online form that you can access to submit amendment proposals, or during the presentation of my report on Friday, in the slides there will be a QR code that points you to the same place. So we're almost done. Slide 314. This is the mission funding plan for 25-26, and it involves activities and initiatives to support new ministries, including what we call SAWC, SAWC, Synod Authorized Worshiping Communities, New Starts, and other initiatives overseen by our Director for Evangelical Mission. In 25-26, there's over $824,000 devoted to these projects. None of it in our operating budget. This is all outside of the operating budget. And 64% of that $824,000 comes from Synod mission funds outside of our general operating budget. The rest of it comes from ELCA grants and additional support from local congregations. The Synod mission funds come largely from the proceeds of closed congregations. Slides 315 to 317. This is a report on 24-25 on the amount of mission support received last year by individual congregations and by I think there are 9 conferences, if I remember correctly. And then slide 318 to 320. This is a list of the Synod grants and scholarships awarded in 24-25 from Synod designated funds. And these include grants from the Latino Ministry Endowment, the Warner Trust Fund, the Catherine Wright Scholarships, Global Engagement Mission Fund Awards, Robert Miller and Lori Lyons Scholarships, and Synod Coaching and Spiritual Direction Grants. So there's a significant amount of money that we send out to congregations through those grants. And then finally, slide 321. This is in the top half of the slide. This is recognition for congregations that provided 2025 mission support intent information to Terry at the Synod. Not everybody does this, but the more congregations that do this, the more helpful it is to us as we plan future budgets. And then there is also additional recognition for congregations that in their plans for support for the year indicate that their plan is to tithe 10% of their the money that comes in from their current income from the members of their congregation to mission support for the Synod. If you think that your congregation should be on either of these 2 lists and is not, or if you're wondering why your congregation is not on a list, you can talk to Terry. I think Terry's going to put her email address in the chat, and she can send you the form to fill out to do this. It's a simple form. I think it's just 1 page. But again, it's really helpful. And then the last thing, there's a lot of pages here we're not going to go through, but the last part of this report, starting on slide 322, is the audited financials that we got from our auditors for 24-25. And as is the case every year, I think their bottom line conclusion is that our financial statements present fairly in all material respects the financial position of the Synod, which is what we always hope for. So there's a lot of information there that I won't go through because it's pretty heavy duty financial stuff.
Come on, I was gonna say it was boring.
Yeah. If you're having trouble going to sleep at night, you might try reading this, but So any questions or comments or concerns?
If I may, one of the things I worked with former Bishop Andy on was building up the stewardship initiatives and visiting churches and lifting that up. And I know we all have a ton of things to do, but I was thinking about the congregation support. Um, and we've had several congregations in the past who had been leaders in that, who I noticed are not on that list now. And I wondered if there's talk about stewardship emphasis or um, where that's at.
Yeah, we have been talking about that. In fact, we're going to talk about it a little bit more at our council meeting on Wednesday, Thursday, which I'm confused on before the assembly starts, because we want to encourage congregations to continue to provide mission support, and it is shrinking. If you look at that very first slide that we looked at, the mission support part of that, which I believe was the red line, you can see, not by huge amounts, but it's dropping every year. And some of that is congregations that are shrinking, so they don't have as much current income coming in, so they can't turn over as much of it to the Synod as they might otherwise like to. Some of it is congregations that have closed. And so there was a question in the chat about whether I have any concerns about the budget. And I think my main concern is not a concern about this year or next year, because I think we have a lot of resources to support the budget. But longer term, if the mission support from congregations continues to shrink, we will eventually reach a point where it becomes challenging to try to make all this work.
Thanks, Alan. If I could, I noticed the designated giving. If you had averaged it out, it was trending upward as the mission support undesignated was trending down. They were kind of inverted, and so that looked like a shift. Perhaps congregations, I don't know individually, but I wondered if some congregations were moving some of their support to designated. For example, like in campus ministries, sometimes things are the pass-through checks that a congregation has designated, which, in terms of campus ministry benefits us more in that half of it isn't going to the church-wide organization, but in the overall system, it's not to the benefit, right? Because it's
Right,
individual orgs instead of the overall system that's supported by the ELCA. And so that's one reason I had raised the stewardship question, is
right,
because that's where we had tended to interpret how we are stronger together as a collective system rather than, kind of picking our
right.
favorite programs.
Yeah, and I think you had asked earlier about the fact that that mission support is declining ever so slightly most years, and even setting aside the Hawaii fires boost a year ago, the designated support, it seemed like it was climbing a little bit every year, but I guess I'm a little bit reluctant to put too much emphasis on that, because we're talking about small changes each year. And I imagine that it varies from congregation to congregation. My own congregation, I think, has put more money into mission support and less money into designated gifts, although we still put a lot of emphasis on those designated gifts. But I think um, we thought it was important to kind of, we are one of those congregations that tithes 10% every year, and we felt like we really needed to figure out a way to boost current income because it was shrinking and it was becoming problematic. So that was our approach, but I think every congregation's different and every congregation has their own challenges.
Can I speak to designated gifts a bit as someone who sees every month how much and every year how much is going to different organizations? The biggest recipients of designated gifts over the years consistently has been disaster relief. And so whenever we have a disaster, we'll see a big increase in designated gifts that come through the synod. And so I think as we have more disasters, we're going to see that's going to keep our designated giving up. Where I've seen it really drop off is we've over the years had a lot of congregations that support ministries outside of the ELCA, outside of our synod, non Lutheran related at all. And we used to have quite a number of those, and those are fewer and far between. Either the congregations are giving directly to them, or and not sending it through the synod, or they're not giving as much outside of that. It used to be every month I would send at least 15 checks off to organizations like that, and now it's maybe 2 or 3. So and then the biggest gifts again are disaster relief, world hunger, and then the Hawaii wildfire was something that was very different than even that, because the word got around throughout the United States and we had gifts from congregations all over. Congregations and individuals all over. Over 300 people sent us donations for Hawaii wildfire. So I think some of that is where you kind of see the increase as we just get more and more disasters that are catastrophic and people want to give to that. So
Thanks, that's helpful, Terry.
Are there any other questions? And did we address all the questions in the chat? Okay. Well, I want to thank you all for attending this session. I know budget hearings are not necessarily the most romantic thing to think about doing on a Saturday morning, but I appreciate your interest. Thank you.
Money's mission, so thank you, Alan and Terry, for your work to keep us focused on the main mission.
thanks, everyone.
All right, take care.
I